In this next chapter, we're going to learn how to build Angular forms. The first thing we need to do is head to our containers folder and we're going to create a new folder. So by this, we're going to create a new container component. So what we're going to do is passenger and then dash viewer. So that's going to be the folder name. Inside of here, you'll want to create a new file. So we'll do passenger dash viewer dot component .ts. I'm going to copy this. We're also going to create the Sass file, so we're going to do .scss. So hopefully inside the passenger viewer in the containers, you should have passenger-viewer.component and the corresponding Sass file. Now we don't need the Sass file just yet, but we'll use it in the future videos in this chapter. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's create our first component. We'll import it from the Angular core as per usual. Now for this one, what we're going to do is create a selector and we're going to call it passenger-viewer. So this is going to essentially allow us to view a particular passenger. Now we'll also set up the style URLs because we have our Sass file. So we'll do passenger and then dash viewer.component.scss. So that finds the file that we just set up here. So passenger viewer.component.scss. So these are all hooked up and we'll just create a simple template and we'll just put an empty div inside. Now what we want to do is first export a class called passenger viewer component. So we're exporting this class. We'll use a constructor because this is going to be a smart or a container component. So we're actually going to inject our service into here. And we're also going to use ng-on-init. So we need to go and import this ng-on-init. And we also need to implement it here. We'll go up to the top and we'll simply import the on-init. So this basically sets up our component. And inside this ng-on-init, we can then go ahead and start making data requests. Now, what we want to actually do inside of here is inject our passenger service, make a call to a specific passenger, and then display it in here. And we're going to use some forms inside a stateless component. So this passenger viewer is a stateful component. It's a container component, and it's going to provide data to a stateless component. So let's go ahead and import our service. So we'll do import. And then the passenger dashboard service, and we'll import that from .. And you can see TypeScript gives us passenger dashboard.service. So hopefully you should have this imported. Now, because we're obviously dealing with passenger objects, we need to import our interface. So that's the next thing we'll do. We'll import the passenger, and again, we're going to have to go back a few levels. So we'll do .. and then .. models. And then inside of here, we're going to have that passenger interface. So you can see that our service is going to be dealing with passengers. So on our actual constructor, what we want to do is first inject this service. So inside the constructor, we will do private and then passenger service, and that's going to be of type passenger dashboard service. So Angular is going to use this token and inject it as this .passenger service. So now we have this available inside the ng-on-init. We want to essentially talk to an existing passenger. Now we don't have a method set up for this, so you can see here I have get passengers. However, we're going to set up a get passenger, which is just going to take a unique ID such as 2, 1, or 3. So we'll default it to 1. We'll then simply subscribe. And the data that we're going to get back is, of course, going to be a single passenger. So again, we're going to use our type checking here. Inside the arrow function, what we're going to do is assign it to a particular passenger property, which means that we need to add it to our class. So we'll do passenger on the class, and it's going to be of type passenger. So we've told the component class to have a passenger property of type passenger. So inside of here, we can do this .passenger equals data, which is the data that's just been returned from our subscription. Now you can see this red underline because we don't have this get passenger method. So let's go ahead and jump into our service because we can go ahead and create this method now. Now you should be familiar with this, and this is actually going to be very simple to implement. Now we've got 2 red underscores because it says a duplicate function. So we only want a get passenger. So we're only returning a single passenger, which means that we are not returning an array of passengers. So we can remove the array. So we can just return the observable with the passenger. Now for this get request, we need to actually pass in this ID, which is going to be a number. Now you can see in the viewer component that we're actually passing in a number to the get passenger call. So inside the dashboard, we're just going to expect an ID. It's going to be of type number, and we need to now pass this into this string. So what we'll do is an ES6 string, we'll say passenger API, and then we'll do / and we'll do another $, and then just ID. And this is just using our passenger API, which is our constant up here. So when we pass an ID in, it's going to be something like 1 or 2 or 3, or however many passengers that we potentially have. So all you can do after that is just simply save it out. So to display this in our component, first of all, we'll just do passenger, and we'll just convert this string to JSON. So at the moment, if we flick over to our app component, we are hard coding the passenger dashboard. Now, what we want to really do is actually use this passenger viewer, so we can actually build out these components individually. And what we'll do in the final chapter is then set them up so we can actually route to them, so this can be dynamically done. So if I save this, we'll actually get an error because the passenger viewer isn't exported from our module. It's also not included in the module. So let's go up and fix this problem. So what I'm going to do is go below in our containers, and I'll do import passenger and then viewer component, and then from, and then /containers /passenger, and you can see viewer is now available. And inside of here, we have the component that we want. So hopefully you should have import passenger viewer component from containers /passenger viewer.component. So now that you've got that, you can simply copy this value. And just like before, we need to include it. Now I'm including it here because these are just generic components underneath, and these are our container components. So that's why I'm including it in this order. Now for us to actually use this component inside of our app, we need to then obviously export it. So what we can do at this point is change our export so we can actually remove the dashboard component, and we can export the passenger viewer component. So this will allow us to then use it in this external module. So now that this is actually set up, we can close off the app, we can close off the module, and we can go ahead to the browser and see our passenger object. So hopefully in the browser, you should see your individual passenger object with the ID of 1. So let's go back to the code. So in this video, even though we haven't actually used any forms, we have set up our first container component. In the next video, we're going to build out our form component. So this is going to live inside components. We're then going to pass this passenger object. We're going to change our data structure very slightly just so we can use some different form directives that Angular provides us. And we'll actually include the forms module. So now that this is set up, we're ready to go ahead with our forms. In this video, we are going to make a few changes to our data structure. Now, if you open up the models and the passenger interface, what we're actually going to do is change this children property to baggage. So if you want to go ahead and change yours and simply change it to a type of string. Now, because we're not using children anymore, we also do not need this child interface. So we can go ahead and completely remove that as well. And then finally, what we're going to do inside the passenger detail component is actually remove these children from here, because we're essentially going to be destroying these pieces of data, and we're going to change our data structure for the purposes of this video. So the next thing is to open up your db.json. Now, currently you will have all these children properties. So if you want to highlight them all and just change those over to baggage, Now you can simply leave them as empty strings if you like. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll create these as empty strings. This one's going to also be an empty string. And we'll just change this one over to an empty string as well. So what we'll be doing in our template forms is allowing the template driven forms to actually drive these changes. Now you can see here that we have 1, 2, 4. So we're missing passenger 3. So I'm going to add another passenger back, and I'm just going to call this one Todd. So we can just leave that as is. So now we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 passenger objects. What we need to do is open up our terminal and actually restart the server. So any changes that we make to the local database, we're going to need to recompile. So once that's done and out of the way, what we need to do is create a new component in this components folder. So go ahead and create a new folder, and this one is going to be called something simple called passenger form. Now inside of here, what we want to do is create the form definitions. So we'll do passenger-form.component.ts. I'm going to copy that value, and then next to it, I'm going to create the SAS file for it. So we'll just do passenger-form.component.scss, and you can see here our folder structure. So we don't actually need this passenger form CSS at the moment, so we'll close that off. But what we're going to do is essentially pass some data down into this form component, and this will then be used throughout the videos to actually teach you how to use the forms based off of the data that we've just created in our passenger viewer. So essentially what we want to use inside of here is this new passenger form component. We haven't registered it in our module yet, but what we'll do instead of printing out this passenger object is actually pass it into a binding. So we'll pass it into a binding called detail. So we have the binding, and we'll pass that passenger object, which comes through asynchronously from our service call. So now that that has been created, we need to obviously fill in our component. So let's do import and then component. I will import that from @angular/core again. We'll create the component definition. And what we'll do is create a selector called passenger-form, which then matches the file name. We'll also set up the style URLs so they're all ready to go. So what we'll do is then passenger-form.component.scss. So now we have everything available. We'll also create the base template. So this is going to be an ES6 string again. And all you can do for now is just create a form tag, and we'll just leave it at that, and we'll just put form inside of here. Now, because this is a component class, we need to export the actual class name. So what we'll do is export the class called passenger form component. And because we just created an input binding called detail inside of here, we need to actually copy this value, and we're going to have a property called detail. Now, the passenger object is going to be passed through. So we need to actually grab this passenger object. So again, above here, what we can do is import that object. So we'll do import the passenger from, and then /models/passenger.interface. So we've got the detail, it's going to be a passenger. Now the next step is telling it that it's going to be an input. So we just import that input again, and we'll just simply decorate that property to say that the detail is then going to be passenger. And just to display this out, what we can do is then do detail, and we'll just use that JSON pipe that we learned about. And we'll save that out, and what we'll do is then go ahead and register it in our module. So if you open up your passenger dashboard module, we can then go ahead and register this component. So what I'm going to do is duplicate one of these, and we'll change this to passenger form component. We'll change the passenger detail. We'll rename this to passenger form so it can find this passenger form component. Inside our declarations, we've imported it last, so we'll add it last in here. We don't need to export it because we're not using it in our other module, and it's just a child component of that module. So that's everything you need to do to set up our base form. However, to actually start building out our form, what we need to do inside this file is import the forms module. So what we can do is import and then forms module. So this is another Angular module, so Angular, and this is going to be from Angular/forms. Now we need to go down into our ng module, and we're just going to register it and say that we can use the forms module. So this will give us the access to directives such as ng model, which we covered very early on in the course, just as a quick demonstration, but now we have full access to Angular's forms module. So now that you've done that, you can simply close it off. We have the passenger form, we have the passenger viewer, and at the moment we don't actually need to use this file. So what we can do is simply close this one off as well. And what we'll start building out is this passenger form. Before we do this, we're going to go and check it out in the browser. So we'll just wrap this in a div real quick. So save that out and we'll go to the browser and take a look. So hopefully in the browser, you should see something like form and then the JSON object printed out. Now you can see this one has baggage. So our actual data structure in the db.json has been updated. And what we're going to use is a bunch of different inputs such as radios, checkboxes, text inputs, number inputs to basically recreate these via Angular's template forms. Now we can confirm this, that we are using the passenger form, as you can see in here. So we have our passenger viewer, which then binds to our passenger form. So anything inside of here is in fact our input data, which means anytime we make a request or want to update something, it will then be populated back down to the form. And as you might have guessed it, in the later videos, we're going to emit that changed value via an event and then make another service call to basically update this whole passenger object, which will then update the API. In this lesson, we're going to cover ng form and ng model. So if you open up your passenger form component, which we have rendered out our details object, what we're going to do is essentially set up something called a template ref, which we've already looked at. So what we'll do here is form and then equals ng form. So what this essentially does is export the ng form, which is an Angular directive, which works under the hood to essentially keep track of all of the state changes and all the validation of our inputs inside our form. There's also one more thing that we need to add, which is something called no validate. So we can tell the form to not validate it because we want to use Angular's built-in validation. So what we're going to do is move this up here and we'll remove the words form. Now we'll build out our first input. So inside of here, we're just going to start with the passenger name just to keep things simple. So we can do input and we'll give it a type of text. Now, because this is a template driven form, each input needs to have a name, and the name that you create will actually create a property on the form for you as an object. So in this case, our detail, we actually had a property called detail.fullname. So we actually want to map that across and use it here as well. And then we'll just close this one off here. What we can do to actually see that this form is changing is, because we're using a template ref, which is the hash form, we could do form and then dot value. And again, we'll create the JSON pipe. So let's go ahead and check this out in the browser. So you can see that we have passenger name, we have our input, we have our data that's being passed in via an input binding, and we have this empty object. So currently nothing has been registered with our ng form. And this is where something called ng model comes in. So let's go back. So what we can do is simply add the word ng model. So we can actually use ng model as a standalone attribute, which is a directive itself from Angular. So now let's go back to the browser and see a different response. So you can see now that we have a property by default called full name. So this is our input data and this is our form value. Now, once I start typing, you can see that this property is being updated via Angular. So ng model is synchronizing the form values for you. Now, at this point, you might be thinking that you need to go back and update this data. However, because we're using template-driven forms, the template is the source of truth. So ideally, all of the properties that we want to create need to be bound to some form of input and registered inside the form to be picked up via Angular. And you can see that we can still update these models and they work as intended. Now, obviously we have this full name of Steve, which was our registered person. He has an ID of 1. So what happens when we need to set an initial value? Let's go back and take a look. So because we have this detail and we have an ng model, how do we communicate between the two? Because we can bind to an ng model using a property binding, we can just simply pass detail and then .full name. So what this essentially does is take the detail object and creates a one-way binding from the ng model. So at runtime, we can use our ng model. However, we're using detail.fullName to essentially populate it with an initial value. Now, because this is an asynchronous call, detail.fullName may not be available. As you can see inside the dashboard viewer, the passenger object is being passed back through a service call. So this .passenger isn't actually available at this point in time. So there are two options here. We can create an object inside of here, and we can say full name and then null, which will essentially allow us to create these initial values. However, this isn't really the best way to do things because we're initializing new objects inside. So earlier in the course, we learned about the safe navigation operator, which is this question mark here. So when the value becomes available, it's essentially going to one-way bind to the ng model. So let's go and check this out. So you can see here that this is the original data model. At runtime, the value has been found, the passenger name of Steve has then been bound to the input. Now, the interesting thing is if I change this to Todd, you can see that our form value is changing. However, our initial value is not changing because this is just a reference model that's been passed down. So the most important thing to remember is that the template is the source of truth, which is the form.value, which we're logging out here. The next thing that we can do is create the passenger ID. So what we'll do is simply copy this, and what we'll do is add it underneath. Now this is going to be of type number, and instead of using the name of full name, what we'll do is change this to an ID, and the passenger also has an ID, and we'll change passenger name to ID. We'll save this out and go back to the browser. So you can see our initial data has an ID of 1, full name is then Steve, Steve is populated, passenger ID is then populated. We can actually use the numbers to increment this, and you can see that this value is changing. Now it won't let me type any letters, however I can type some numbers if I wanted to. So if I wanted to change the passenger ID, I could then submit the event, which we'll come on to later in this chapter. So again, we are populating our data model from the ng form, which we're exporting as a template reference variable, so we can actually see things for debugging purposes. Our initial data set, we're populating and binding to ng models. We can change the ng models. We can set them via one-way bindings. So that's essentially how to create a form using ng model and inputs. In this lesson, we're going to cover radio buttons and how we can bind them to our forms. If you go ahead and open up your passenger form, we can then start populating. Now, what we want to do is actually create a new section underneath of here where we're going to use some radios. Now, our passenger can be checked in or checked out. So we're going to use a radio button to essentially toggle between whether they are checked in or checked out. Inside, we'll create a label and we'll just close this one off. Now, inside of the label, what we want to do is input and then type equals radio. Now, the name is going to be checked in, which is the property that the passenger will actually have. And the way that we can use this again is with ng model to decide whether they are checked in or checked out. So again, we'll do detail and question mark, and then we use that dot checked in. So when they're checked in, Angular will then set this model value. Now, because it's a radio button, we actually want to give it a value, and a value typically looks like this. However, because we can use Angular bindings, In this case, we want to use true or false. If we didn't use these braces here, this would actually be passed through as a string. So you can see that this has gone orange. If I undo those changes, it's then gone blue. So this will actually be passed as a Boolean value. All we want to do underneath here is simply put the word yes. Now what we can do is copy this label and paste it below. And we're going to change it to no, and the value is then going to be false. Now, because radios have the same name, they can then talk to each other and essentially be part of the same group. So this is all we need to do to tell Angular to use the ng model. And if they are checked in, it will check this radio. If they're not checked in, it will then check this radio. So let's go and check this out in the browser. So you can see from our initial data set, it says checked in is true and our input is then checked. The other one is not checked. However, when I do check it, it says false and our initial data set stays the same. So this is working as expected. Now, one thing we do have is this check in date, and you can see that this is a timestamp. Now, when I click yes, we obviously want to generate a particular timestamp. So we'll go back and add a ngModel change function so that if the passenger has just been checked in, we're then going to generate them a new timestamp. We've learned about this before, and we're going to use the event binding. So we'll do ngModel change, and we'll just pass in a function called toggle check-in. This is obviously going to give us an event back, which will be true or false. When the model changes, the event is going to be the value. So it's actually going to give us the value back. We can simply copy this ngModel change, add it to the second input. And what we want to do is add this function to our component class. So inside of here, what we can do is simply pass the event through, and all that's going to be is a Boolean. However, to make things more readable, we're just going to call it checked in. It's still going to be of type Boolean, but it makes sense when we do something like this. So if checked in, we want to then create a new timestamp for that particular user. So at this point, we're going to do this.detail. So we're actually going to access this particular passenger, and we're going to create a check-in date. Now what we can do, two options. We can do plus new date, which will create a new date object. Alternatively, we can do date.now. So this will essentially give us a new milliseconds value. So let's go and check this out in the browser and see what happens. So when we go back to the browser, you can see this initial timestamp that we have from the check-in date. When I click no, it checks the passenger out. And when I click yes, you'll notice this timestamp has just changed. However, we're not actually displaying this new timestamp in an input. So what we're going to do is go back and actually register it with our template. To do this, all we need to do is create an ngIf. We'll wrap this in a div, and we'll do *ng and then if. Now, instead of using something like detail.checkedIn, because we're using the local form reference, so we're using form.value, if the form.value.checkedIn is available, then we want to actually render out this data. So we can say check-in date, and inside of here, we will just do input with a type of number. It's going to have a name of check-in date. And again, if the date exists to begin with, we want to set that initial value. So we can do detail $.check-in date. So if there is an initial value with this check-in date, we're going to create it in the DOM. If there isn't, then we're not going to use it. Now this actually has an effect on our passenger interface. So originally our checked-in date could be null if we wanted it to. However, what we're going to do is actually remove this null value here, and we're just going to say it's a number and it's completely optional. So because we're using a template driven form and the way that Angular works, it will not actually set the null value. So what we're going to do instead is just make this an optional property on the passenger object. So now that we've created this, we are checking if the passenger has just been checked in. We're creating the words checked in date. We're creating a type number, we're giving it that name check-in date, and if there is an initial value, which means that they are previously checked in, we're then going to simply render it out as an initial value, which means that if we check them out with one of these radios, so if we say no, it will then set this value to null because the ngIf will completely destroy this DOM node so that it will no longer exist in the actual form, so our ng model won't exist. However, if we then check them back in, it will click yes. It will then recreate this DOM node, and when it does, it will then create this toggle check-in, which then creates the timestamp for when they were then checked in. So let's go ahead and check this out. So you can see here that we have check-in date and 14907 and so forth, and we have the exact same one here. So you can see that checked in is true, check-in date is now matching up. So this is the initial data, and we're now matching it against our template driven form. Now, if I click no, you can see that the check-in date has completely disappeared. However, when I click yes, it's then come back. We've got the check-in date and the milliseconds are as of this particular moment. So each time we do this, we're going to get a different value that's being bound to the local form. So in this video, you've learned how to create an input with a type radio. You can bind anything you want to. You could create a dynamic variable in a component class if you wanted to, and bind it using an initial value. You've learned how to create a name. We've set some initial data. We've then cleverly used an onChange function inside our component class to actually generate a new timestamp. In a real world application, this may be done on the server. So when you actually post this object back, your server may actually return you the check-in date once it's been confirmed. However, for this demo, we're just going to create it here in the component. So next we'll move on and show you how to use checkboxes. In this video, we are going to learn how to bind to a particular checkbox. Now, a checkbox is fairly simple. It either returns a false or a true value. Once checked, it's true. Once unchecked, it becomes false. So what I want you to do is jump into the passenger form component. Now, in the previous video, we set up these radio buttons. Now, what we'll do is actually delete the last radio button, and we're going to convert this one to a checkbox. Now, because it's a checkbox, it does not need a value. However, we are going to leave the name as checked in. We don't need to actually use the word yes because it will simply check or uncheck itself in the DOM and be quite apparent as to whether it's actually checked or not. We're using the exact same setup as before with the ng model. If there is a checked in value available, then we're simply going to use it. On a change, we are then going to toggle that check-in. And because the checkbox returns true or false, this function will just work similarly to the radio buttons, which in this case, it might be a better way of doing things. However, we're just going to demonstrate both of the examples. So let's go ahead and jump across to the browser. So you can see here we have checked in is true with the timestamp. If I untick this, everything disappears like it did in the previous video. When I retick it, we get those new values that have just been created. So in this video, you've learned how to create an input with a type of checkbox and bind it to a particular model to keep it synchronized with the overall form template model. And it's important to remember that the template is the source of truth, not your data model. So the template data will be updated, and then we can go off to the back end, make some changes, and update our local data here, which will then flow down because this is one big stateless component. In this video, we're going to learn how to create a select menu with a dynamic option element. Now, an option element can use an ng-for, like we've already looked at in this course, and we're going to explore some of the details. Now, we're going to use this because I told you to create a baggage property on your interface. So what we're going to do inside this models folder is actually create a baggage interface. So go ahead and create baggage.interface.ts. Now all we're going to do in here is export an interface called baggage. And it's only going to have two keys. It's going to have a key of a string, and the second one is just going to be a value, which is also going to be a string. So that's all you need to do, is export an interface called baggage with a property of key and value, and both of them are going to be strings. Now we're going to use this to dynamically create our select menu. So we'll close this off and jump into our passenger form. Now inside of here, what we're going to do is create the select menu. So first off, we are going to wrap it inside a div. We'll create some simple text. We'll say it's going to be the luggage. And first off, we are going to say select, and we'll close that off. And then we'll do option. So we're just creating the setup here for our select menu. Now, as before, we also want to create a property called baggage because that now exists on our interface. So we can just do name equals baggage. So this will then be picked up by the ng model and create that property for us. If the passenger has some baggage already assigned to them, what we can do is ng model and then equals the detail and then question mark again dot baggage. So if they have some baggage already checked in or selected against them, this will then appear and dynamically check it in the menu. Now the interesting part is on the option. What we want to use is something called an ng-for. Now we'll set this up and then we'll actually write the code for it below. So we'll do let item of baggage. However, this baggage property does not exist on our component. So this select menu will actually break because it cannot loop through these items. So the first thing we'll do is import that baggage interface. So we'll import baggage and we'll change this one over to baggage.interface. So hopefully you should have the passenger interface and the baggage interface. And we're going to use this one locally inside our form component. Now, if you scroll down to your component class, we're going to create a static property here with a baggage array. So what we'll do is quickly break these up a little for readability purposes. So underneath here, we will create this baggage and we're going to say it's going to be of type baggage. However, it's going to be an array. Now, because it's going to be static and local to the component, it's going to be an array of objects. Now you can see that this is highlighted in red because we do not have key or values. So if I do key and we'll say none, and then we'll do value, which is also going to be a string, and this is going to be no baggage. So if the passenger decides to have no baggage checked in, we can then select this option for them. What we can do is go ahead and copy this, and inside of here, we want to say if they have some hand baggage. So we can do hand and then baggage. Now we want to change this key because we want to assign it to the particular passenger. So we'll do hand and we'll call this one hand only. We're going to give them a few options. So we're going to create a few more properties. So I'm going to duplicate these. So we have no baggage, hand baggage, and obviously we can check in something like a suitcase. So this will be called a hold baggage. So we'll do hold only, hold baggage, and if they have both, we will do hand and hold. And what we'll do here is hand and hold baggage. So we've got four options here. We've got no baggage, we've got hand baggage, we've got hold baggage, and we've got hand and hold. So if they want to check a suitcase in and take something on the plane with them, they can do. So this will essentially allow us to populate this ng-for. So what we want to do inside of here, because the item is going to be each individual baggage item, we can then print that out in the DOM. So what we can do to start with is simply do item.value. So that will actually give us this string value here. So hand baggage here will actually be rendered out as an option in the dropdown. Now to bind the values that we want to assign the customer, we can do value and we can just use the item.key. So let's go ahead and check this out in the browser. So immediately you can see that Steve has no previous baggage because we set these to an empty string. You can see we have a list of baggage here. I'm going to check hand baggage and you can see that this property here has now been changed to hand-only. If we then change it to hand and hold, you can see hand-hold and we can say no baggage and it changes it to none. So this is working correctly However, if Steve did have an existing item, we want to set that selected property to be the default. So let's go back and implement that functionality. All we need to do for this is use the selected property. Selected you should be used to if you've used an option element before. So what we can do is just do selected. Now what we want to do is just a simple comparison check. So we can say if the item.key matches the detail.baggage, so equals detail, we'll do our safety question mark dot baggage. Then we can then set that value dynamically to the selected item. For the sake of this demo, what I'm going to do is actually go into my db.json and I'm going to say Steve has a value of none. I'm going to open up my terminal again and restart the server just to get those changes updated. So when we go back, we will see that Steve has none as a selected value because we've actually implemented this check here. And we'll see on the option element that the selected attribute has been added. So you can see that we have baggage is none and no baggage has been selected. You can also see that this has been reflected down here. So if we go ahead and change it to something else, this piece updates and this piece stays the same. So the template again is the source of truth here. Now what we need to do is refresh and we'll inspect element on this. Now let's go ahead and inside of here, you can see that we have this ng reflect selected equals true. So Angular itself is actually telling the DOM to set this selected property for us. So in this lesson, you've learned how to create a local model of baggage, for example. So we're looping over a local item baggage and essentially matching it against what a passenger already has. We can update the passenger's details if we want and set an initial value. There is also one more thing that we can do if we wanted to. Now what I'm going to do is simply copy this and use something called ng value. What that means is we can completely blow away this, and just for clarity, we'll keep both of them in the DOM. By using ng value, we'll essentially implement this logic that we've just written here. However, this is a bit more explicit and easy to read as we're obviously binding to selected properties, so our intent here is a little bit more descriptive. ng value is a nice to have if you do know the API. However, if you don't know the API, this is much easier to look at as a developer. So let's save this out and go back to the browser. So this one here is using ng value. It's got no baggage. We can change it to hold. It's then been updated here to hold only. We can also update this one to hand. And because they're different DOM elements controlling the same model, they won't conflict with each other. However, they will update the actual model value when something changes because they're using one-way bindings and events. So in this video, you've learned how to create your own static array. We've used a type check against it just to make sure that we're implementing it correctly. We've then created a select element. We've given it a name of baggage, which will then create a property on our form. We're binding any existing models. We're using an ng-for, which is very simple, just to iterate over our static array. The value of the option is then set via the key, so we can set these to whatever we like. We're also using the selected property binding. So Angular here is just doing a quick expression to look up which one has already been selected in the initial data model. And then we just print out the value of what the user wants to see. And finally, we've learned about ng value, which essentially does all of the above for you, but keeps it nice and simple in a single directive. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to display validation errors. So if you jump across into your form component, I've actually removed the select value, which uses the ng value in favor of the value and the selected properties, just to keep things simple and nice and readable. All the source code is obviously going to be available, so you can go back and reference each version as well as using these videos. Now, the interesting thing is when we want to actually implement validation is where we're using this template reference up here, we can actually use them on these elements themselves. So let's assume we want to create something called full name. Now, what can we export? Much like ngForm, we can actually export the ngModel. Now, ngModel does so much more underneath than just a simple value binding such as this. It actually keeps track of validation states for us. So what we can do is log out this full name, but we can also look at the errors. Now again, we'll convert this to JSON and go and take a look at it in the browser. So in the browser, we have the value of Steve and we have null, which means that there are no errors. Now, if I remove Steve, you would expect an error to occur. However, we haven't actually told Angular that we need some validation. So this is where we can add something called the required attribute, which I'm sure you're used to when dealing with forms, and Angular will pick up this automatically and tie it into ngModel. So as soon as we go back here, we can add this required attribute. It doesn't need a value, it just needs explicitly binding. What we're also going to do is add this required attribute to the passenger ID. Again, we're going to use ID equals, and then we're going to export the local ngModel. So all these references are exporting the models for the particular input. So Angular is actually using this ngModel binding, and we can simply reference it here. What we'll do beside here again is actually do the JSON, and we'll use the ID.errors. So when we go back to the browser, we will see our errors come into place when we remove the values, because we've used the required attribute, and Angular and that ngModel will know about this. So you can see that we have Steve. Now, if I remove that, you can see that we have this required and then true. So our form now has an error called required true. Now, this isn't local to the input itself. The actual ngForm that controls the entire form actually has knowledge of this as well. So we can update this to Tardan. You can see the value goes away. If we empty this, we also get the required true error. And if we add the passenger ID back, null has become the value. So there are no errors in our actual form. There's also one more thing that we can do to log out the form errors. Now what we're going to do here is wrap this one in a div. Now what we can do is duplicate this and look at a property called valid. We're also going to put the words valid next to it so we can see that it's valid or not. Otherwise, we're going to look at something called invalid, and as you guessed it, we can look at something called invalid. So in our browser, we have valid true and invalid false, as you'd expect. Now, when we remove this, you can see that our form has then changed valid to false. So this ties in really nicely when we want to actually provide values and error check. So let's go back and implement our validation states. If we scroll up to our passenger name and passenger ID, this is where we actually want to implement the errors. Now what we can do is actually use this fullname.errors to implement our validation. So to do this, what we can do is create a div tag, and we'll close it off in here. And the passenger name, which is what we're using here, so we can say passenger name is required. All we can use is a star and then ngIf. Now the interesting thing is we want to use this detail.fullname. However, we are exporting the ngModel, which is keeping an eye on the actual validation states as we've just seen. So to do this, what we actually want to do inside our ngIf is do fullname.errors. Now you've seen in the DOM that this can either be null or it will be an object with required true. So in this case, if we have an error.required, this will work fine. However, if we're using null, this is going to throw an error. So again, we use the safe navigation operator just to make sure that if this becomes true, then this error is then shown to the user. Now what we're going to do here is just create a class called error, and then just add some simple styling. So if you want to open up the passenger form.component.scss, we'll actually add some quick styles inside of here to separate our form out and add the error states. So the first thing that we'll do, just to give these divs a bit of breathing room, is we'll do div and then margin 0, 0, 20 pixels, just to give us some gaps. And the class that we just added is the class of error. It's going to have a color of DA and then 6969. And we'll bump the font size down slightly to 10 pixels. Now we'll close this off and go back to the browser. So you can see immediately we have no errors. If I remove Steve, it says passenger name is required. Now there's one interesting thing here, is that if the name wasn't there to begin with, such as if we were creating a new passenger, this would actually display this error message before the user has even interacted with the form. So let's go back and fix this problem. Now to do this, we can use something called dirty. So what we can do is fullname.dirty. Now the dirty property means that the form controls value has changed. So if the user has actually interacted with it, such as deleted it, then this expression will be evaluated. What this means is at runtime, this error message will not be shown because fullname.dirty will actually be false because the user has not interacted with it. So we only want to show these errors once a user has interacted. Now again, for the passenger ID, we're going to do something similar. So I'm going to highlight this and scroll down. We're going to replace this ID errors JSON and just paste this one in. We'll change these full names to ID. We're going to use the exact same setup with errors and the question mark. We're looking for the required attribute again. And instead of passenger name is required, we're just going to use passenger ID as required. So if we go and empty the ID and also empty the name, the errors then appear. We can then start adding them back and start adding them back, and the errors disappear. And these will just update as the user is typing. So these are really handy when we want to display error messages at a specific point in times. There are also properties such as the .touched property. So if I then touch this input and then left the input, that would actually fire what we call a touch. So instead of using dirty here, we could just change this to touched, which means that if there was no value to begin with, and the user clicked on the input and then left the input, this error would actually show. So it depends on your validation strategy of which you want to use. I personally prefer using dirty over touched because it allows the user interaction first and gives them a gentle reminder if they've deleted something via their own input. So in this video, you've learned about the basic validation. You've learned how to create a template reference, which exports a reference to the ng model. So we're binding the ng model, which is the details.id. What's important to note is that all this is doing is setting the initial value of the ng model, and ng model is taking care of lots more under the hood. Now, by using a template ref, we're actually gaining access to what ng model is doing. So you can see here we have errors and dirty and all these different required properties. You can also implement things such as min length if you had 0, and these would be available such as min length. So it's very extensible and you can use multiple different errors if you like. So you could copy this, we could add a min length if we wanted to, and add a min length property here. However, for this demo, we don't need it, but now you know how to do this kind of stuff with your forms to show and hide based on the validation states. In this video, we are going to jump again into our form component. We're going to do some cleanup because we have some data floating around, and we're also going to learn how to disable the submit button if the form is invalid. So go ahead and copy the form.invalid. And what we're going to do is simply delete all of this. Under here, what we're going to do is create a button. Now you can give it a type of submit. Inside the button, we can just say update passenger. Now we don't need to bind an event such as a click because of the way that forms work. If it's a type of submit, it will then bubble a submit event up to the actual form where the submit event fires. We'll do that in the next video. However, for this video, what we're going to do is essentially use the button and show you how to disable it if the form is invalid, so that nobody can actually press submit if the form is invalid. So what you need to do is simply do disabled and then equals form.invalid. You could obviously invert this and do not form.valid. However, form.invalid is a little bit more readable. So let's go ahead to the browser and check out these changes. So in the browser, I can highlight Steve. We see our passenger name is required, and we can scroll down and you can see that I am no longer allowed to click this button. However, if I type something, you can see the change in the color of the button because I'm actually reducing the opacity, and I can now click on the submit button. In the previous video, we looked at our form component and the disabling of the submit. Now the time has come where we want to actually submit our form. So if you jump up to the top, what we can do is actually create an event. Now you can use submit, however, ng-submit is also preferred. Now ng-submit actually does some extra stuff for you, such as telling the ng-form underneath that in fact the form has been submitted. So what we want to do here when ng-submit is fired, we'll just create a function. Now it doesn't take an event, but we can also pass our form. Because this is a template driven form, the form is the guider of the model. So what we can do is take the form. We could pass in the form as a whole if we wanted to. But whilst we've been debugging, down here we were doing form.value and displaying the actual full object. And that's exactly what we're going to pass through in here. So what we're going to do is form.value, but we're also going to do form.valid. Now we'll explain why momentarily. So we'll do handle submit when the ng-submit fires, and on the component class, what we'll do is create this handle submit function. So inside the function arguments, we actually get the event, or you could call it a value. We'll just call this one passenger, because it's going to be of type passenger, because we've matched up our directives that we've been building out throughout this chapter to basically create our form for us. So what we're actually getting back is a passenger object. The second argument we'll call is valid, and that's going to be a Boolean. Now the reason we're going to do this is because you can simply inspect element and remove a disabled attribute from a button. So with JavaScript, we can just have that second level of control just to make sure that the form is in fact valid. So what do we do at this point? Now this is a stateless component because we have an input called detail, and it communicates with the passenger. It gets past the passenger, we bind it to the form. So on submit, we don't really want to talk to an API because this is in our components folder and it shouldn't really communicate with an API. So what we really want to do is create an output. Now we'll set this output up, and then we'll actually go and set it up in the parent. So we'll create an output, and we're going to call this output update. So anytime that we want to update, we're going to actually fire an event. Now, as per usual, we're going to use the type event emitter. And in previous videos, we have used type any and done new event emitter. Something like this. So let's go ahead and import output and event emitter. So we'll do output and then event emitter. So we now have the input, we have the output, we have event emitter. And when we scroll back down, those will all be fine. Now what we're actually emitting, and why we didn't want to information overload you in previous videos, we're actually going to emit a passenger object. And you can see that that works absolutely fine. Now the interesting thing is we can also pass the type to the instance of the event emitter. So this is technically the correct way that we should set up our event emitters. So now that we have the output set up, we can go to the passenger viewer. Now at the moment, all we have is passenger form with detail. and we need to add this output called update. All we're going to do on here is a simple function callback, and what we'll pass in is a function called onUpdatePassenger. And obviously, because we're using an event, we're going to get the event back. So what we'll do is quickly set up this function on the component class. So we're obviously going to get an event here. It's going to be a passenger object. And inside of there, we'll simply log this event out. So before we can actually grab this event, we need to actually emit this event, which is where the submission comes in handy. So because we've got an instance of event emitter bound to our output called update, all we need to do inside of handle submit is this .update.emit, and we're just going to emit that passenger object. So as soon as the form has been submitted, we're going to make that is valid check. If it's valid, we're simply going to make an emit call and update the parent. So this is then going to get picked up via the onUpdatePassenger. Our event's going to be fired, and we're simply going to log it out in the console. So let's go ahead to the browser and check this out. So you can see that we have our form, and what I'm going to do is change this to top motto. Now there is no local state here being persisted. What we do, we'll press update passenger. You can see object, full name, ID 1, checked in true. We have the timestamp that corresponds to Steve. However, the name has now been changed to top motto. And you can see that this is coming from passenger viewer.component. So our container component is actually getting notified once we're updating something from our form. So you might be thinking at this point, what do we do with this event? We obviously want to update the particular passenger. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do this .passenger service. Now we already set up a function called updatePassenger, which you can see here. So all we need to do is just pass it the event, and we can just simply subscribe to it. So we're going to call subscribe. We're going to get that data back, which is going to be of type passenger. And then in the response callback, all we're going to do is this .passenger equals. So we're going to use object assign, pass in a new object, and then we're going to do this .passenger. So what we'll do is merge those new changes against the current this.passenger, create a brand new object, reassign it back to this.passenger based on the event that was passed through. I can change the name to top motto. Now, when I go and update passenger, that has now made a request. So I can refresh, and you can see that that data has now been persisted. We can open up the console, of course, and we can go ahead and confirm this, and we can change the name back to Steve. It's made that put request to /1. So in this video, you've learned how to create a submit event and then pass that event back up to our container component. We've then communicated with the service and then updated our backend API.